He sits across the table from a friend of 15 years. He's calm. He speaks in a soft, measured tone. His posture is relaxed, his shirt crisp, his smile polite. By every social metric, he is the picture of reason. Then his friend makes a minor mistake. A simple slip of the tongue. A forgotten promise. Nothing malicious. You would expect a normal reaction. Maybe a little frustration. Instead, the man's eyes go dead. He doesn't yell. He doesn't throw a fist. He simply leans in and begins to dissect his friend's character with surgical precision. He unearths secrets from a decade ago. He twists a simple error into proof of deep moral corruption. He speaks with the absolute certainty of a judge passing a death sentence. He doesn't look angry. He looks relieved. He looks like a man who has just cleansed his own soul by dumping a bucket of poison into someone else's lap. He walks away smiling, convinced he is the victim, convinced he is the righteous one in a world full of enemies. You watch this happen, and a cold realization sets in. This wasn't about a forgotten promise. The target didn't matter. The friend was just a mirror, forced to reflect a darkness the man refuses to see in himself. Why does a person need to destroy someone else just to feel clean? What kind of internal architecture requires a constant supply of enemies just to survive the day? To understand a mind like this, you have to look past the polite smile. You have to look into the basement of the human psyche. Because Carl Jung warned us about this exact pattern almost a century ago. And once you see how the mechanism works, you will realize this person is not just difficult. They are dangerous.
Yeah, and that mechanism, it's honestly terrifying when you see it operating under the surface.
Yeah.
Because what you're watching, that surgical dissection of a friend, it looks like power.
Right? It looks like this cold, calculated strength.
It's actually a sign of someone teetering on the edge of a complete structural collapse.
Yeah.
For some people, just their psychological survival, like their ability to have any stable sense of identity, it relies entirely on this illusion of absolute purity.
I mean, they have to believe they're morally spotless.
Spotless. The internal narrative is totally unyielding. But human nature guarantees that we are all just this chaotic mess of irrational fears and resentments and selfish impulses.
We all have that ugly stuff.
And in analytical psychology, this collection of all the rejected, inadequate, or socially unacceptable aspects of our personality, that's called the shadow.
Okay.
The shadow. And the critical dynamic here is the cost of trying to maintain that illusion of purity. The cost is the continuous, really compulsive projection of your own inner darkness onto a scapegoat.
Oh, so because the conscious mind refusing to acknowledge it, it doesn't just go away.
No, it actually demands a physical target out there in the real world.
So if I'm understanding the mechanics of this right, the conscious mind is essentially building a quarantine zone.
Yeah.
Like the person feels a flaw or maybe a malicious impulse inside themselves, but admitting that would just shatter their self-image as this morally pure being. And the psychological pain of that is just intolerable.
You completely break them.
Right. So instead of feeling the guilt, the mind does this sleight of hand. It takes the offending trait, kicks it out of the self, and assigns it to the poor friend sitting across the table.
They dump the poison.
But taking this out of a localized one-on-one conflict, the modern context for this seems completely different. If we look at the concept of the persona in our current digital world, we're dealing with identity curation that is just unprecedentedly rigid.
Oh, the digital scale changes everything.
Right, because the modern online persona, it operates like a heavily filtered, high-definition photograph. People build and polish these avatars to perfectly match whatever their specific subculture decides is morally or aesthetically superior.
Every post is a performance.
Every opinion is just another brick in this wall of curated righteousness. But this brings up a huge conflict, right? If the persona is managed so tightly to get maximum social approval and avoid any friction, doesn't that suppressed shadow inevitably have to leak out somewhere else?
It has to. It's a mathematical certainty. You're taking all the messy, unacceptable parts of human nature and compressing them into a smaller and smaller psychic space.
And that pressure needs a release valve.
Yeah, and that structural compression, that is really the defining psychological crisis of our era. When you build a persona that has zero contradictions, you aren't actually eliminating your contradictions.
You're just hiding them.
You're forcing them underground. Carl Jung was super explicit about this danger almost 100 years ago. He pointed out that the persona is basically a compromise between you and society about what you're supposed to look like.
It's just a mask.
It's only a mask. But in a digital environment, you're required to wear that mask 24/7. So the person starts to over-identify with their own curation.
They start believing their own hype.
Exactly. They believe they actually are this flawless, righteous citizen. And as that belief gets deeper, their ability to tolerate their own shadow drops to zero. But and this is the scary part, that repressed material still has energy.
It's still active.
Right? Because it's denied any healthy expression. It mutates, it leaks out in these really indirect, destructive ways. In the digital sphere, we see this show up as mass moral outrage, anonymous hostility, the whole phenomenon of cancel culture.
I'm trying to wrap my head around how this mutates from an individual issue into mass behavior. Like, it's one thing for a guy to project his insecurities onto his friend at a coffee shop, but it's another thing entirely for millions of people to suddenly synchronize and attack a single target online.
It's a massive escalation. But to map how that works, we can actually look at a really well-documented microcosm of this exact dynamic. The researchers pulled data from the 2021 season of Big Brother Brazil.
Holy, reality TV.
Yeah, because reality TV is basically a controlled laboratory for watching the persona disintegrate.
That makes total sense.
You take people, strip away their normal social support, put them under constant surveillance, add competitive stress, and those carefully constructed masks just crack. The shadow gets dragged into the open.
So what happened in that specific season?
So there was this massive conflict between two contestants, Carol Jung and Camila De Lucas. The public at home started watching Carol engage in some really deep manipulation, sowing discord and projecting her own unexamined insecurities onto everyone else in the house.
Okay, so she's acting out her shadow.
And eventually, Camila confronted her. She basically refused to be the punching bag for Carol's projections anymore. And during this fight, Camila explicitly said out loud that she felt out of character, like she had lost her temper.
Wow, so that's like a textbook example of the shadow breaking through the persona in real time.
But it's the audience's reaction to that fracture point that shows us the structural issue.
Yeah.
The viewers didn't just passively watch this drama unfold, they mobilized.
Right, they got involved.
The digital response was instant. Phrases like, "The giant has awakened," started trending everywhere. The audience basically formed this unified, punitive mob.
They became a digital firing squad.
Yeah. And that mobilization is a perfect illustration of the social shadow. Just like one person represses their ugly traits, a whole culture represses what it decides is intolerable. Things like overt prejudice, cruelty, manipulation.
So when they saw Carol doing those things,
It activated their own unconscious recognition of those exact dark traits within themselves. But instead of doing the hard work of self-reflection, admitting they might also be capable of cruelty, the millions of viewers projected the entire culture's social shadow right onto Carol.
she became the ultimate scapegoat.
She became the singular vessel for all of their repressed darkness, and that is the engine of cancel culture. It's a collective social sanction where mass digital behavior steps in to replace formal state punishment.
But the whole architecture of that mass sanction, it completely relies on a lack of nuance, right?
Really.
Because for a crowd to execute that kind of punishment, they have to be absolutely convinced that they are morally superior. If they stop for even a second to realize that the target is a complex human being and not just pure evil, the projection wouldn't work.
It would fail instantly.
And it seems like the digital environment actively encourages this moral absolutism. Like, the interface itself lowers the social cost of expressing really intense punitive emotion while constantly feeding you a stream of perceived rule breakers.
It's an outrage machine.
So for the person in this system, the righteous purist, the world has to be black and white. The enemies can't just be flawed people. They have to be cartoon villains, totally devoid of humanity.
They'd have to be monsters.
Because if the purist acknowledges the humanity of the target, that fragile wall protecting their own repressed self just collapses.
The dehumanization is a strict requirement for their psychological survival in that moment. Realizing the target is human means realizing, oh, I have that shadow inside me too.
And that's too painful.
It's catastrophic for an ego built on the illusion of purity. So the enemy stays a monster. And we see this exact same internal architecture driving American political discourse right now, across the entire ideological spectrum.
And we really need to emphasize that this is completely impartial. This mechanism operates identically regardless of political leaning.
Exactly. The content changes, but the psychological sequence does not vary. Whether you're looking at a left-wing ideological purge inside a university or a right-wing coordinated doxing campaign against a dissenter, it's the exact same engine.
The group represses its own capacity for intolerance or cruelty.
Right. They project that exact capacity outward onto a designated political enemy and then attack that enemy with overwhelming fervor. They end up in an environment entirely populated by enemies who are just reflecting their own unintegrated darkness.
That is terrifying because it's a self-perpetuating feedback loop. projecting the darkness doesn't actually relieve the internal tension, does it?
No, it just makes the world look more hostile and dangerous.
Which then justifies even more extreme punishment against the enemies. It's a paranoid spiral.
A total paranoid spiral.
But that explains a mob or an angry individual online. It raises a much deeper structural question for me when this psychology scales up to intersect with actual institutional power.
Right, when it hits the state level.
How does a whole functioning bureaucracy or an entire populace just surrender its rational agency to these unconscious dynamics?
To really grasp that, we need to dive into the concept of archetypal possession.
Okay, let's ground this in a highly specific scenario. Let's look at Hungary. Imagine a mid-level bureaucrat. We'll call him Gabor.
Okay, Gabor.
He works in the Ministry of Justice. He's sitting in this quiet third-floor office overlooking the Danube. He isn't some street-level fanatic waving a flag. He's professional. He's detached.
Just doing his job.
But his daily reality for the last 12 years has been drafting these dry, technical, legislative amendments. And these exact amendments have quietly, systematically dismantled the country's independent institutional checks.
The boring paperwork that changes a nation.
Exactly. He's the guy writing the clauses that redraw judicial retirement ages, which effectively forces out independent judges. He's writing the bureaucratic jargon that shifts oversight bodies under executive control.
So he is the machinery.
Now, outside his window, you can hear the rhythmic thumping chants of massive political rallies echoing from Costas Square. And when Gabor goes home and turns on the state broadcast, he watches the prime minister towering over a sea of waving banners.
Framed as the ultimate savior.
Right, the defender of the Christian homeland. But when Gabor watches this, he doesn't feel manipulated. He feels this hypnotic relief. In the shadow of this massive mythic archetype, his own individual agency, his personal moral responsibility, suddenly feels tiny and irrelevant.
It dissolves.
It totally dissolves. The next morning, he's back at his desk. There's a formal protest letter from the National Bar Association sitting right there, explaining how his latest directive is unconstitutional.
And what does he do?
He ignores it completely. With a steady hand, he signs the order transferring the nation's historical archives over to a state-controlled foundation. In that exact moment, he has successfully traded the heavy, agonizing burden of personal conscience for the warm, numbing comfort of collective destiny.
That transition you just painted, that is exactly what Carl Jung identified as archetypal possession, or Griffinheit.
Or Griffinheit, yeah.
And we have to understand, this isn't just someone being persuaded by a political argument. It is a fundamental alteration of human consciousness.
It's deeper than just agreeing with a policy.
Much deeper. In a state of archetypal possession, the person experiences a comprehensive loss of ego consciousness, that distinct, autonomous human being who can make rational choices, feel moral hesitation, or analyze facts. They cease to exist.
They just get wiped out.
They are submerged. Jung described it as becoming a flat collective figure. They turn into an automaton, entirely possessed by a mythic script that is ancient and infinitely more powerful than their own individual will.
So Gabor feels relief because the archetype has completely absorbed the weight of his personal responsibility.
He doesn't have to carry the burden of choice anymore. The myth decides for him.
But how does that mythic takeover actually function across a modern democracy? I mean, we operate under this assumption that educated populations who have access to diverse information and rational debate are insulated from this kind of psychic possession.
That's the comforting illusion of modern democracy.
So how does a populace voluntarily just hand over their rational discourse to become actors in a myth?
The vulnerability is that rational discourse is actually incredibly fragile when it goes up against the emotional gravity of an activated archetype. We have empirical data on this.
The survey data from the Hungarian election.
Yes, the 2022 election between the incumbent Viktor Orbán and the challenger Peter Márkizai. The researchers used this event to map the exact blueprint of how this mythic takeover happens.
So what did they find?
They looked at the intersection of populist attitudes, partisan identity, and charisma. And the findings are stark. Populist attitudes basically act as the primer. It's this deeply held belief that a pure, unified people are under siege by a corrupt elite.
It's an us versus them foundation.
And that worldview generates a massive psychological demand for an idealized leader, a savior who can vanquish the corruption.
So the people are basically building the mythic stage themselves. They aren't looking for a guy to manage tax policy. They are actively scanning for the defender archetype to arrive.
They are waiting for the myth to embody someone. But the research isolates a really critical secondary mechanism here. Populism creates the demand, but partisan identity is the binding agent.
Oh.
Partisan identity in this state doesn't just mean you really like your guy. It fundamentally requires the absolute rejection and vilification of the outgroup leader.
Oh, so it's not just support, it's destruction of the opponent as proof of loyalty.
Destroying the opponent becomes the foundational proof of your membership in the in-group. The outgroup leader gets stripped of any political legitimacy and is transformed into the literal embodiment of the corrupt elite.
Which just skyrockets effective polarization.
It locks the whole populace into a state of irreconcilable hostility.
And the conflict completely detaches from any material reality at that point. Like, they aren't debating economic theories or healthcare infrastructure anymore. It's purely about identity survival.
It's existential.
Because if you're fully submerged in this collective myth, the opposing leader can't just be a politician with bad ideas. They have to be perceived as a literal threat to the narrative that gives your life meaning.
And this is the exact mechanism that connects modern political movements to deep historical precedents.
Okay, and again, strictly impartially, looking at the internal architecture.
Absolutely impartially. When we analyze leaders who wield this kind of massive charismatic authority, whether we are looking at the current dynamics with Donald Trump in the US or tracing it all the way back to Julius Caesar, we are looking at figures who have tapped into ancient archetypal currents.
They embody something older than themselves.
Right. They frequently step into the outsider archetype, or they activate what anthropologists call the killing of the king ritual dynamic. They don't present as administrators of the state.
They present as the vessel.
Exactly, the singular vessel for all the collective grievances, fears, and hopes of the crowd. They become the physical embodiment of the activated myth.
And if we focus just on the architecture of this, the power isn't actually coming from the leader. The leader is just stepping into a pre-existing psychological void.
Jung explored this brilliantly in his essay on Wotan.
Wotan, the ancient Germanic god of storms and frenzy.
Right, martial obsession and frenzy. Jung proposed this framework where archetypes exist as dormant psychic riverbeds within the collective unconscious of a society.
Psychic riverbeds.
It perfectly illustrates the mechanics of collective possession. These riverbeds, these ancient patterns of tribalism, frenzy, and the craving for authoritarian order, they are permanent structures in the human psyche.
But they usually sit dry.
Right. They sit dry during periods of stability. But when a society undergoes massive stress, severe economic anxiety, rapid technological dislocation, deep cultural alienation, the waters of collective anxiety start to rise.
And if the rational democratic institutions seem too weak or corrupt to hold back that anxiety,
the water inevitably surges right into those ancient archetypal riverbeds. Suddenly, the whole society is swept up in a torrent of fanaticism and mythic thinking.
So the political leader who steps into that current, they aren't generating the energy from scratch.
Their main function is just to be the highly visible vessel for a psychic force that has already broken the dam.
Which goes back to Gabor. He feels relief because the overwhelming current of that archetype has just washed away the fragile structures of his individual morality.
It's a psychological narcotic.
Giving up the burden of critical thought to a collective myth is deeply relieving. But we have to recognize that this surrender, this archetypal possession, isn't just happening at massive rallies or inside government buildings.
Oh, the most alarming evolution is happening in total isolation.
The technological infrastructure we use every day seems explicitly designed to accelerate this radicalization on a totally individualized basis. Let's look at another scenario to map this out.
Okay.
Picture a 24-year-old named Leo. He lives almost entirely inside his basement bedroom. And the physical reality is bleak. Stacks of unwashed plates, stale air, total social disconnection.
He's completely unmoored from the physical world.
He hasn't spoken a word to a real-life neighbor in months. The only light in the room is this harsh blue glare from his smartphone. But inside the encrypted forum channels on that screen, Leo isn't an isolated, unemployed kid. He is a vanguard commander in a digital holy war. For 3 years, the platform's algorithm has mapped his vulnerabilities with terrifying precision. It's been feeding him a steady, escalating diet of moral outrage.
Because outrage holds attention.
Right, so his entire worldview narrows into this paranoid, binary, absolute righteous purity on his side versus demonic, systemic corruption on the other.
Classic shadow projection.
Every personal failure in his real life, losing his job, his crushing isolation, his feelings of inadequacy, it's all projected outward onto whatever parasites are trending on his feed.
He blames them for his pain.
And tonight, he is coordinating a synchronized doxing campaign to destroy the life of a local investigative journalist who criticized his movement. As he's typing, Leo experiences a surging rush of archetypal inflation.
He feels like a god.
He feels like the cleansing sort of truth. But then, in the middle of this, his mother timidly knocks on the bedroom door. She just asks quietly if he has eaten today.
A grounding moment of reality.
But Leo's reaction is terrifying. He snaps at her with this cold, unfamiliar rage, because in that moment, he doesn't see a mother showing care. He sees her through the lens of the archetype.
She becomes an agent of the corrupted world.
An operative trying to weaken his resolve and interfere with his sacred mission. He is completely consumed by the darkness he thinks he's fighting.
That scenario is a perfect forensic illustration of how digital echo chambers radicalize people. And they don't do it by introducing foreign, complex ideologies. They do it by weaponizing the most fundamental mechanisms of shadow projection and archetypal possession.
So what's actually happening in that basement, mechanically?
We are watching the algorithmic amplification of the shadow. There's a brilliant conceptual model in the sociological research that describes algorithms as the siren and the sailor.
Oh, like from mythology.
When a sailor leaves the physical land, which represents grounded, embodied, biological reality, they enter a unpredictable, fluid psychological space. And the siren's song doesn't lure them by playing random noise. It lures them by hitting the exact frequency where their deepest, unarticulated longings intersect with their most profound fears.
And that's what the algorithm is doing.
But at a scale and speed that the human brain cannot mathematically comprehend. These architectures constantly map our attention, our micro-hesitations, our specific triggers.
They know exactly what makes us tick.
And they feed those highly customized frequencies back to us in an endless loop.
So the algorithm is essentially a funhouse mirror.
Yes.
But it's been engineered by thousands of data scientists to only reflect the user's shadow. It takes Leo's suppressed resentment and impotence and magnifies them until they cover his entire horizon. It convinces him that his internal distress is actually a vast global conspiracy that requires his immediate punitive action.
It outsources his psychological pain.
Which brings up a massive question about causality. Does the technology actively create this state of radicalization, or is the algorithm just a hyper-efficient delivery system for ancient human pathologies that have always been there?
It's fundamentally a delivery system. But in systems theory, when you change the scale and efficiency to that magnitude, it actually constitutes a change in kind.
It becomes a different beast entirely.
As the algorithm alters the psychic landscape, because it operates as a massive, outsourced collective shadow. It amplifies archetypal possession by locking the user into what Jung called the enemy complex.
Meaning society gets forcefully split into irreconcilable opposites.
Leo isn't just angry, he is in full archetypal inflation. The digital interface lets him totally bypass the moderating friction of physical human relationship.
Right, he doesn't have to look that journalist in the eye. He doesn't have to process the real-world pain he's causing.
He instantly plugs into a mythic identity that turns his isolation into heroism. And this leads directly to a really devastating psychological state identified in the research called situs inversus.
Situs inversus. The mechanics of that seem totally central to understanding why these digital echo chambers are so intractable. How does that operate inside the user's mind?
Well, to understand the damage of situs inversus, we have to quickly look at how a healthy mind develops. In Jungian psychology, growth, the process of individuation, relies on the transcendent function. It's this difficult, often painful capacity to hold two conflicting, opposing viewpoints in your mind at the same time. A healthy ego endures the immense tension between those opposites until a third new integrated perspective emerges.
So you synthesize the conflict into growth.
That synthesis is the engine of human maturity. Situs inversus represents the complete mutual neutralization of that transcendent function.
So the capacity for synthesis is essentially paralyzed. The engine of growth just seizes up completely.
The digital echo chamber, driven by these algorithms, violently halts psychological growth. It locks the user in a static, perpetual state of elevated outrage and shadow projection.
They're constantly agitated, constantly mobilized.
Never internally transformed. Integration is structurally impossible because the algorithm ensures that any conflicting information is only ever presented as a cartoonish, bad faith threat.
So Leo is completely trapped in this paralysis.
Totally trapped. He gets the biochemical rush of power, But psychologically, he's frozen in amber. He is caught in this loop, utterly incapable of synthesizing the painful reality of his real-world failures with the complexity of the outside world.
He just substitutes the endless static warfare of the screen for actual psychological development.
It's tragic.
It's a state of suspended animation masking as high-stakes conflict. He feels like a warrior, but he's a psychological captive. And to really see that captivity, we have to pull the lens back even further.
To the hardware level.
We've been talking about the software, the algorithm, but we have to look at the foundational architecture of digitalization itself. Because the medium isn't just delivering the message, the medium is actively enforcing the psychological state. The sources rely on this conceptual model called the stack to explain planetary computation.
Yeah, Benjamin Bratton's model.
It divides the digital architecture into 6 layers: Earth, cloud, city, address, interface, and user. The critical insight here is how the interface layer, the physical screen of your phone or monitor, acts as a massive, impermeable repression barrier.
It's a literal wall.
It literally severs our embodied presence from our interactions. We completely abandon the earth layer.
And the earth layer is our biology.
We leave behind the breath, the thermal reality, the pheromones, the microexpressions, the shared physical vulnerability of just sitting in a room with another biological organism.
All the friction of reality.
We reduce the entire human experience to disembodied fingers swiping across sterile glass.
And that physical severance from biological embodiment, it is arguably the most consequential psychological shift in human history.
Because it removes reality testing.
When your primary interaction with the world is through a screen, you're engaging with a Janus-faced interface. It gives you this illusion of total frictionless connection to the whole globe, but simultaneously enforces absolute physical isolation.
So you feel connected, but you're actually entirely alone.
You're alone with the screen. And because the grounding reality of physical presence is gone, the digital space becomes this incredibly fertile, frictionless environment for projection.
There's no physical pushback.
None. The screen just absorbs whatever your unconscious mind throws at it. The research points out how digital platforms, and especially these new advanced AI entities, function as perfect projection screens for anima or animus possession.
Okay, the anima and animus, those represent the unconscious feminine and masculine ideals, right? The deep relational archetypes inside the psyche. So how does losing the earth layer allow these archetypes to possess how we interact with, say, an AI or a digital avatar?
It hinges on the complete absence of genuine subjectivity. Yeah. A digital avatar, an influencer's persona, or a highly sophisticated conversational AI. They lack true otherness.
They don't have their own messy life.
They don't have a biological body that gets sick, or a personal history full of trauma, or an autonomous unconscious mind that will actively resist your expectations.
They just reflect you.
Because that friction is absent, individuals seamlessly project their deepest, most primitive ideals and longings right onto these digital entities.
They form intense emotional dependencies on influencers they've never met.
Or they treat AI chatbots like perfectly attuned, infinitely empathetic, romantic partners. But this entirely bypasses the fundamental requirement of a human relationship, which is complexity.
It completely bypasses reality testing.
The user isn't relating to an autonomous person. They are relating to a highly reflective mirror that is just bouncing their own archetypal expectations right back at them.
It's a perfectly sealed psychological loop. The user is essentially falling in love with, or getting their entire sense of worth from, a high-definition hallucination of their own design.
It's narcissism disguised as connection.
And recognizing this widespread descent into hallucination and tribalism brings up a profound paradox about the era we live in.
What's the paradox?
Well, we live in a civilization that possesses tools of seemingly omnipotent knowledge. Through the internet and generative AI, we have effectively actualized the magician archetype on a planetary scale.
We have infinite knowledge at our fingertips.
We can summon the entirety of recorded human history, translate any language instantly, access any philosophy in seconds. Yet, overwhelmingly, we use this omnipotent infrastructure to build increasingly narrow, primitive, and tribal realities.
We use a supercomputer to throw digital rocks at each other.
How do we reconcile this infinite access to objective information with such a profound collective flattening of our psychological and emotional depth?
That paradox is really the defining tragedy of the digital age. And it's precisely what the researchers call the shift toward post-dialectical consciousness, or the condition of digital flatness.
Post-dialectical consciousness.
To understand the flattening, you have to look at how human consciousness historically evolves. Psychological maturation has always required dialectical tension.
Meaning conflict.
Specifically, it requires the experience of profound disappointment.
Disappointment is the engine for growth.
The historical mechanism works like this. You hold a naive illusion or a projection about the world. You go out, and you encounter the friction of reality.
And reality doesn't care about your illusion.
Right. Reality bitterly disappoints you and shatters the illusion. And through the very painful process of processing that disappointment, you gain psychological depth and a more integrated understanding of truth.
You grow up.
You grow up.
Yeah.
But the architecture of the digital interface, the infinite scrolling, the instant gamification of social approval, the algorithmic curation, it creates an environment where true disappointment is systematically neutralized.
You are totally insulated from the friction that causes growth.
We exist in a state that the research describes as being pre-disappointed.
Pre-disappointed. Because the algorithm anticipates every bump and smooths it over.
It smooths everything over. So the world presented through the screen appears entirely flat. There is no vertical depth required to understand it, no transcendent goal to strive for, no teleological orientation guiding you toward maturity.
When you can instantly get a perfectly tailored answer from an AI or swipe past any uncomfortable emotion,
you entirely bypass the agonizing dialectical struggle that actually forms the human soul. Disappointment in the digital ecosystem doesn't act as a catalyst for transformation anymore.
It's just a momentary pause before the next swipe.
Just a pause before the next dopamine hit or hit of synthetic outrage. We are hoarding vast oceans of data while simultaneously eroding the structural integrity of the self.
We're replacing lived, embodied experience with frictionless digital simulation.
And because we've severed ourselves from the grounding reality of the earth layer and fiercely avoid integrating our shadow, the immense power of the magician archetype only serves to accelerate our psychological fragmentation.
It's an incredibly sobering reality to map out. We have engineered a planetary infrastructure of infinite connection that somehow leaves the individual utterly isolated, locked in a basement with nothing but their own unexamined ghosts reflected back at them in high definition.
And the implications of this mass flattening extend far beyond just individual mental health or toxic social media feeds. When you project this dynamic forward, particularly into the rapidly advancing realm of AI-enabled warfare and global security, the concept of shadows of the machine becomes existential. As lethal military decision-making and strategic analysis become mediated through these exact algorithmic infrastructures, the greatest risk isn't the sci-fi scenario where machines spontaneously develop consciousness. The immediate terrifying danger is that humans are drastically overestimating their own consciousness. Without deep psychological integration, without confronting the shadow society, is simply constructing autonomous lethal systems that will function as massive projection surfaces, allowing humanity to automate its most unexamined, primitive, and destructive impulses on a planetary scale.